Life prior to the Industrial Revolution was a life that had rarely been changed for hundreds of years. Most of the people in the world were employed as farmers. There were no factory workers, there were no office workers. There weren't many of the jobs that we are familiar with today. In fact, very few of the jobs that exist in the current day were there before the introduction of the steam engine and the total change of society. The reason why a large amount of the population was made up of farmers was because prior to the Agricultural Revolution, there was no real way to maintain a steady supply of food. It all depended on the changing climate and a variety of random factors, all of which came together to make sure that you never knew if it was going to be a good harvest this year or a bad one. Farmers left the field to rest, cutting their available farmland by a third, something reduced with the Agricultural Revolution and the introduction of clovers and nitrogen-rich plants to enrich the soil. With so much uncertainty, famine was a common problem for those who lived in the pre-industrial world to have to cope with. There was little useful money outside a very small number of people. Everything was bartered for. For the small amount of food that could be produced, wasn't eaten and wasn't taken as tax, had to be carried to the cities on carriages pulled by mules. Each carriage was made of wood and couldn't carry much on it or it would collapse. Each journey was made through the countryside. These carriages were liable to get stuck in the dirt roads if it rained or the ground was wet for some reason that day, turning into a thick mud. These had to be dug out and pushed with sheer effort. There weren't any rescue services to be called after all. These carriages often carried with them the food of an entire village of farmers, safety in numbers. You never knew when a brigand or a bandit might come and try to steal all your food. With food supply being unreliable, cities were not as large as they are now. People couldn't just all head to the city if there wasn't going to be enough food to feed them, and so they were much, much smaller. In fact, many of the suburbs in our cities today used to be towns and villages outside of the city where people could rest before they carried on walking. These cities were not very advanced either. With no steam engines, they didn't have a way to produce electricity, so there were no electrical lights. Any light after dark was made with lamps which had to be oiled and cleaned, and the only areas of the city that had any were important. These cities were considered the center of civilization, but themselves often lacked things like sewage systems and public services which we take for granted today. There weren't proper police forces, no road workers, no postmen unless you lived in a very specific part of the city. Letters were often handed off to people heading off in that general direction. If you wanted anything, then you needed to rely on yourself. After all, if you wanted to talk to someone or talk to someone that wasn't within walking distance, then you needed to head there in person. There were no phones, postal services, or even signal towers. The very things necessary for us to consider a society as civilized, none of it existed.